My name is Matt Zigler. I am a maker educator at a school called Bullis, just outside of DC. I come to making through the visual arts realm. So I have an MFA in painting. I was an art teacher for about 10 years before transitioning into the makerspace. So everything that I've learned about technology and making has come after that point, other than some carpentry skills for building stretchers and things like that in my painting career. So it's been an interesting experience coming at it, I think, from that direction. And I hope that that means that I have some different ways of looking at making in general than somebody coming at it from the computer science or engineering realm. And I think that it's important to sort of share that and hopefully allow teachers that haven't gone through that experience or people who are interested in learning other ways to evaluate creative projects, like Dale said, industrial arts rather than just sort of engineering. And that's why about a year ago, Make and Dale actually reached out. We published a book. It's called Three Modes of Making, and it has a lot of information about how my school does things, how I've done things, how I've seen making from the eye of a creative artist as opposed to a technology-based background. And I wanted to share some of that with in this session because I think one of the hardest things for educators, there's so many resources for great projects, really fun ideas of how to structure a class, how to use materials, how to design really engaging and fun projects for kids. And maybe there's less emphasis on how to assess that work. And as much as I would love to not have to do that, I think that, maybe in reference to what Dale was talking about with maker spaces that are now empty, administrators and schools that have a vision will support a maker education program regardless of sort of demonstrable outcomes. But school systems, public school systems, and more traditional schools, they want to see they want to see outcomes. They want to be able to point to information. They want to be able to point to metrics, whatever that means, and say, yes, this is a valuable thing. And if they can't point to that, then programs, run the risk, I think, of being defunded or just dropped altogether. And so I wanted to share some of the ways that I work with assessing students in, it's kind of impossible in this kind of work to assess in a way that is like a standardized test, and I wouldn't want to, even if it was possible. But I do think it is possible to sort of allow students to demonstrate improvement and growth and competency in various areas, and also to have some of those areas be things that are not just technical skills. So let me pull up my slides. And I am also going to, in the chat, I'm going to drop a link to basically a copy some of the resources that are in this slideshow so that you can have them as Google Slides. They're editable. They are sort of reflection activities that I do with my students. And so these are the templates, and then you can, play with them or edit them to your preference. So I'll post that in there. All right, so the goal of this talk is to really focus on assessing the creative process and not the product. And what I mean by that is simply, I don't grade students on the end result. I don't grade them on the object. And that comes from many years of, let me skip through some of this stuff. Oh, I'm showing you so these are the resources. I'm going to switch to a different tab here. I think. Here we go. This was my experience in all of my art classes in college and grad school, the sort of critique, right? You go off, you're given a task, you're giving a prompt or something, you spend a couple of weeks working on a few pieces or a day if it's something else, and then you put your work up on the wall and everybody clusters around it and you explain what you did, and then everybody gets to sort of usually pick it apart in some way. And that becomes, the structure, and that was certainly the structure that I used as an art teacher when I first started working with students. And I felt like that was really hard because as a teacher, the expectation is that I can somehow look at this finished piece of art and understand what you went through as a creative person in order to get to that point. And sometimes I think you can. Sometimes I think you can look at the finished product and have a sense of what the student went through, and hopefully I was also able to see some of those challenges that they went through in the moment. And it's not like they were doing things alone, although sometimes they do, right? In college, certainly I would work in my own studio and then I would bring it after a week and we put it up. So the professor had no idea what I had been doing during that time and would only react to what was put onto the wall in front of them. And I felt like that was an inadequate way of sort of thinking about assessing students, particularly in a high school and maybe even more in a public high school, because a lot of the students that come into my classes are not going to become artists. They're not going to become art teachers. And so what are they getting out of this course? What is important for them to walk away? Because I wanted my art courses to be valuable, even to those students who, they were it was an interesting elective, or maybe they had no other option, but I wanted them to be able to take something into the world that was valuable. And so I started to
Uh,
think more about creative process. And
Matt, I hate
yeah,
to are you I'm not sure what if you're sharing so we can only see the front slide of the resources
okay.
tab. So I don't know if you had
Um,
another slideshow that you
I
wanted to
can't.
share.
I'll, there we go. Is that better? The art class critique?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, so luckily I haven't shared too many slides, but um, I think that the equivalent in the maker world is sort of this, like the project showcase, where students work or, work for a number of weeks on a project and then they put it out on display and you invite people to come and look at that. And I think that that is a really important experience and we do that. But that is, for me, not what I'm looking for. I am interested in the decision making that the students exhibited during the creation of that project. What creative moves did they make? What types of experimentation did they use in order to solve a problem? And that's not always evident in the final product. And in fact, you can have students who come to your class with a background in making and maybe have some resources on their own or have done some camps, and their work is going to look very different than somebody who has had no experience, but maybe worked really, really hard to solve some problems. But because they don't have that experience, that final product does not look as impressive in some way as another student. So I felt that it was very important for my assessment of those students to reflect what they were doing in the process more than just the product. And this is another way that we often, reflect. We do the project, and at the end, we give them some form of reflection prompt for them to write. I think, the idea that we don't learn by doing, we learn by thinking about what we've done is a lot of maker educators think about that. However, when your reflection comes at the end of the product or at the end of the process, it's almost a little bit too late to use that reflection, especially when you've maybe done one or two projects in an entire class, right? The pace of maker education projects often leads to the point where you are finishing the big thing at the very end. And if you do your reflecting, what would you do different? How would you do this in a different way? What would you add to it? It's too late to act upon that. And so, I like to do assessment of that process throughout the time. And so I think, my favorite way to think about assessing maker education is by thinking about being a coach. My son is 10. He's a big baseball player. So I watch his coach and how he structures his practices. And his coach is very emphatic about the fact that in his mind, if he could just do all practices all season and never have a game, that would be more important than if it was all about the games. And that's why I love the Little League right now, because it is so practice based, and he gets a lot of opportunities to learn and to practice before he has to put it into place in a game. Now, of course, he loves the game, so that's where he wants to go. But I love the practices, and my son's coach is constantly assessing during those practices, and he's constantly working one-on-one, but also thinking about the group structure of how those practices take place and what skills the students are doing. And so if you think about that, then if you're going to do a sort of practice-based assessment, then you want to be able to do some of the same assessments over and over again so that students have an opportunity to improve on them rather than simply do it once and say, okay, you've got it, and then move on to the next thing. So I have a structure that I'll talk about in my class that allows students to do the practice, get graded on it, get feedback on it, and then if they're not happy with the results of that practice, they can do it again on a future project and resubmit it, and then do it again should they need to as well. And so these are sort of the things that I'm looking for in my class. And you can see, the book that I wrote is called Three Modes of Making. And the reason why, I think about making in terms of three different sort of types of activities is so that I can focus on these different skills, which can be addressed by different types of maker activities. So the first one is called imitation. It's like following a recipe, finding a tutorial to follow. And we use it to introduce a lot of new skills. We use it to introduce a lot of those sort of like pacing yourself activities. And so following blueprints and evaluating ideas and finding resources are all things that we can do when we're doing those sort of, follow a recipe and make the thing that's on the website or in the book or whatever it is that we want to do. The next sort of mode of making that I write about is modification, and this is where we start to look at things in the world that exist and change them, alter them to our purposes. It might be personalizing them, changing their color, changing their texture, putting googly eyes on them, whatever it is that helps us sort of take a little bit of ownership of the world around us. It could also be starting with a concept and then modifying it to your own purpose. I know Jeff was just talking in this previous session about a French cleat. So here's a thing that exists. How can I use it for my own needs and my own purposes? And that would be a sort of a modification kind of mindset. And so thinking about designs that you find in the world, dealing with constraints, those are all things that you can practice when doing modification. And then the last one is innovation. And so these are some of the skills that I focus on when I'm talking about innovation with my students, which is like the iterative design process, improving it through a sequence of stages of improved versions, thinking about your materials that you're going to use, sharing your ideas with others. If you come up with a new idea or a new way of doing something, you want to make sure that you're able to communicate it and share it to other people. Yeah. And so how do you assess those things? That's what I want to talk about, is one, thinking about rubrics, right? Hopefully a lot of people here are using rubrics. They're very useful for grading creative sorts of tasks, but they can also be very limiting. A lot of rubrics will tell you what an A is. On maybe the left-hand column is the A, and it says do this for an A, do that for an A. And essentially, I find that to be very limiting in the makerspace because you are giving students the recipe to get that grade. And a lot of the students that really do interesting things in the makerspace will actually not do those things. They'll go beyond them. They'll get distracted. They'll focus on some interesting part of the project that is not in the rubric, and that you're going to have to grade them a little bit harshly if you're going to stick to your rubric. Hopefully you don't. You just fudge the rubric. But and then there will be other students that come in that they do not challenge themselves particularly. They look at the rubric and they do exactly what is in the checklist, and that gives them an A, but they haven't really challenged themselves very much. So this single point rubric. I didn't design this. But it's a pretty common thing out there. A lot of people that I've talked to have heard of it. But the idea of this is that you are giving them this center column. This is the basic expectations. This is, a B, if you want to do that, or a C if you want to go that route. And you are saying, in order to meet the basics, you have to have this. This is what I'm looking for. But if you want that higher grade, then you are going to be adding to it. You're going to go beyond it. And that really leaves it up to the student in how they're going to do that. What other additional things might they add to their project that pushes it beyond, just like the food is at the correct temperature and it tastes good, and it sort of addresses what the eater wants, right? So then it's like in this sample here. So maybe it's the food is something that they've never had before, or it's something that is made gluten free, or whatever it is that they've decided to add on as an additional challenge beyond that helps push it into that A range. So, like I said, I have some sort of templates that I share with my students, and they're activities that we do at various points in the process. And when we are just starting out and we're doing imitation, this is the first template that I give them. And like I said, I dropped a link in the chat. You can open this up and you can mess around with this. And I'm actually going to go out of slideshow mode here so that I can play around with this slide. And the idea of this is that even when you're doing a basic project, you want students to learn how to set a goal. If they can set a goal on a very simple imitation project, hopefully they can set a good goal for a more complex project later on. And there's a lot of different goal setting methods out there, but the one that I like is just three categories. Something that has to be challenging, has to be, push you a little bit. It has to be something that is achievable. You can't pick a project that's impossible and set that as your goal. That would be a waste of your time. And then you have to objectively be able to measure success. And so we talk about, what contributes to the achievability of something, a project, and what is a potential challenge that you can predict. And the idea for me is that students can think into the future and start saying, I can look at this tutorial that I found on Instructables or something on printables that's an assembly of 3D printed parts. What's going to be challenging about that? It could be things like I don't know how to use the 3D printer yet, but it also could be that, I only have this much time. So let me think about my time management might be a challenge. And this idea of balancing out your resources and your challenges so that you can get a visual on the front end of whether this is a doable project or not. This is the template. Like I said, they can sort of mess around with these. They can represent visually whether this is a large challenge, or maybe you have a lot of small challenges and one or two big resources, and that balances out, and that's okay. But you want to think about that ahead of time. And so just to show some examples here. Oh, and this would then be the rubric that would go with it. So completion of the slide, do they have all the parts in there so that I can actually assess their thinking, right? If they're missing oftentimes the students will be missing a part, like maybe they don't have the link to their project. Well, it's really hard for me to judge how well they are, assessing their goal if I don't know what their goal is or what they're trying to make. So that's something that then, I kick back to them and say, complete this part of the slide so that I can see it. So they get just a complete or incomplete for whether the slide is there. And then I'm just looking at two different concepts here. So one, do they have the understanding of the concept of how these things work together, the balancing of resources and challenges, and that they actually came up with an objective measurable criteria for the goal. And then the critical thinking, are they able to sort of say, this thing, a 3D printer can be a resource, but it can also be a challenge. If I don't know how it works, then that's a challenge I have to overcome. If I do know how it works, then it's over here in my resource category. It's going to help me accomplish my goal. So those critical thinking skills of what is going to be involved in actually doing this, and some of that is just reading the instructables or reading the tutorial. That is a critical thinking skill as well. So some examples of student responses to that is, I'll go back to full screen here, but this is a student who this is an interesting example because this student has a lot of maker experience, and essentially, you know, I feel like did not really represent their project very well. I think, a lot of times, like I said, those students who have a lot of experience can come in and sort of take it for granted. They just want to jump right in because they know how the 3D printer works. This student actually has their own 3D printer at home. So there's a big resource. And, so I can see the critical thinking there, like this is going to help me a lot in my project. But there's not much detail involved in this response. And so, that gives me the opportunity to give that student some feedback. And if it was high stakes, if this was their only opportunity to do well on this grade, then that would be kind of tough. We'd have to spend a lot of time with this. But, like I said, this is one of the first things that we do. And if I give them feedback and say, you kind of got the basics, this is like an 80, 85, that's okay. You can do it again on one of your future projects, then they can resubmit it and put a little bit more thought into it, put a little bit more effort and show that not only can they think about it, but they can actually communicate their thoughts about it. This is maybe a little bit more detailed response, but one of the interesting things about this one is, to me, just visually, I see that there's a lot more information in the challenges than there is in the resources. So that's an opportunity for me to give feedback to the student and say, is that really what you think the situation is, that you may not have the resources you need to actually accomplish this, or is that a failure of your ability or your desire to communicate? So hopefully, this is something that allows me to get a glimpse into their thought process as they're planning out their project, as they are thinking about what it is they want to do, and give them some feedback that they can act upon and then practice in the future, more like the baseball practice than the showcase. And so here's an example of that. This is a student who this was her first attempt at this, and the goal is, that it looks pleasant. That's not very objective. We talk about that in our class, and then things about challenge, there's just not a whole lot of information here. And so, we give that feedback, and she came back later on in the trimester and submitted this, which is a much more, I think, visually helps me understand that she's really thinking about this new project that she's selected, and a much more measurable, objective criteria and a better grade for her. So sometimes students submit this kind of feedback the first time, and they feel like they never have to really do that again unless they just want to sort of think about it. But students that show that maybe they didn't get the concept, or they didn't take it seriously, or they're having trouble with the communicating their ideas, have an opportunity to do that. Maybe now that we've gone through one, I'll pause. Does anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts about any of this? Does anybody do something similar? All right.
Hey,
And let me know if, yes.
hey, Matt, this is Jason. Thank you for this. I mean, I noticed some things that look familiar to me, but I like the visual nature of this, and kind of balancing of resources and challenges. Can I just ask really quick, my first part of my question is, this would be an example of like a project that's a modification, would you say, or imitation?
So, I mean, I think you could use this in any type of project. Anytime you're sitting down, you want to set a goal. I think it'll look very different if it was an imitation, because for me, I can look at the tutorial and I have a pretty good grasp already of what's going to be involved in the project. For something like an innovation project where they're really, maybe they don't know what the end product is going to be. I would be more interested in just sort of seeing evidence that they're thinking down some possible pathways that project might go.
Okay. My bigger, more overall question though, I think is about um I think like you were talking about how once you see this, then you know how to check in and coach the student. And I'm probably not the only person in this boat where um I feel like I have really limited time with my students. And so if I think about coaching and checking in with them in real time, in class time,
Yeah.
that's always been one of my big challenges. I've been a little bit successful doing it like asynchronously, actually. So like after they leave the class, I've done some things where I've coached them through like, let's say a Tinkercad design through like a video screen recording, and then I email it to them and then they watch it in their like study hall period kind of thing. Um, but that doesn't feel that's not going to be I'm trying to think of like if you want to give some kids like real good coaching and feedback on their process and have that you need to have that real time back and forth conversation. I'm just trying to think about ways to mediate that better because of either you have a lot of students and you may not have a lot of time, let's say every
Yeah.
week to do that.
Yeah, I mean that is always going to be the challenge. One of the reasons why I do use Google Slides is because I can drop, a link to a video or audio feedback into the slide as a comment,
Mm,
and they can listen or watch it back right there. That also then sometimes creates a little bit of a conversation. You can sort of, send messages back and forth,
true.
but if it seems like there is something that it's hard to communicate, then at least I can say, we're gonna come. We have like office hours every day, and then or in class, and so I try to I keep a list. I have a sort of like I need help list that's on the
Mm,
board, and I will pre-populate it at the beginning of each class with people that I know have either need some time to talk about one of these things or something like that. Although as much as possible, if it is more of a let's think about our project rather than let's do something with our hands, I try to get that done during office hours or asynchronously as possible so that then when they come in and they need help with a tool or something like that, then that time is more dedicated for that. But I do, I find that I think as a lot of teachers will find, there's the kids in your class that are constantly, help me, help me, help me. And then there's the ones that sort of fade into the background. And this will sort of trigger me to say, all right, I need to add her name to the top of, I'm going to go to you first, right? I'm going to start out the class. We're going to sit down. We're going to talk about this a little bit because she may not want to raise her hand in class, but I know that there's some concept that she's missing a little bit.
cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So the question about Microsoft environment, I don't know. I mean, none of these slides are super, complicated. Like they're just sort of shapes and lines and little blocks of areas where I direct students to add, images or text or whatever. So it wouldn't be hard to recreate some of them. Should you want to in the Microsoft environment. Um, I, I have been thinking about ways that I could, use Canva or something to like share downloadable resources or something like that. So maybe that's yet to come.
So if you're able to access the slide online, you should be able to download them as a PowerPoint file. So just go to File and then Download, and you get an option, PowerPoint, you can do a PDF, even a JPEG or a PNG. So
Yeah, that'd be great. So I guess if you can access it from a personal account or something like that, and then download it as a PowerPoint, that should hopefully it would all be there. Yes. So let me. I think I can just. So this link that I'm posting is it's a forced copy Google presentation with the editable slides. So it's not the whole presentation, but the video will be posted later. And but these will be slides that you could mess around with or redo or whatever. So um, the next activity that we do, which they've sort of set their goal, they thought about their imitation project, they went through it, and then we do essentially, if you've done a thing and you've done an imitation project and the goal was to really understand a process or understand a tool, gain some background skills and knowledge, then you hopefully are able to communicate that in a clear way to other people, and preferably even other people that maybe aren't me, right? Don't have the sort of pre-knowledge of what you're doing. And so we watched this video. I'll play it. There's a billion of these on YouTube, but the idea of these totally handy videos is there's no text. It's all just music, and I'll play it, but I don't know if you'll be able to hear it or not, but we don't need the music anyway. But what I try to highlight to students is that, like, I still don't know what that spray is, and I really want to know what that spray is if I ever need to remove paint from a 50-gallon drum, because it looks very satisfying if very toxic. But I know what it's meant for. I know why this person is doing it, right? Like I get the point because of the way it was visually represented. They didn't have to spend 15 minutes talking about this chemical that they're using and why they're doing it. They just needed to spray it and then and remove it. And that, for me as a casual viewer, I can understand what they're doing. And so they build this whole thing. I think we usually watch just the first project. And some of these tools are tools that the students have used, and some of them are tools they've never seen before. But they do a really good job of, just that little like view of the pop rivet being pulled in, just is a great little moment. And I'll say, so why are they putting that stuff on there? And they all, because so you don't cut yourself on the metal, right? Or, they've never used a grinder before, but they understand by these two views that you're cutting through this metal drum. And so I have them essentially try to do the same thing with their project, using images and symbols only to talk about how their project evolved. Then they can then they are going to lay out for an uneducated viewer what are the key parts of this process. And I only give them these 8 little boxes, so they have to keep it to 8 boxes. They can do it less than 8 boxes, and they have to somehow visually represent the key steps. And so this would be an example of probably a version of the project that only I would understand. If you were a casual observer, it would be really hard to get what it is that is actually being shown here. There's some 3D printing involved, and ultimately, I think we're gonna I'm still not quite sure. I guess these are the eyes here, and so there's an attempt. I can view this and see, yeah, okay, I can see that you're showing me the basic steps of this process, but I don't think you've really communicated it. I'm not sure that you've hit all the high points even, and so. I'll skip forward here. This is probably a better example. This is a student who followed a tutorial to make a phone stand. I think it's probably not a very good phone stand, but she found it and followed it step by step to make it. And so here's the different shapes that we're putting together in Tinkercad, and here's making the little supports for printing, slicing it, printing it, and then removing all the supports, adding little icons here to help like sort of say this is why I'm holding this thing, is to like show you that I'm snipping off supports here for my flush cutters. And this is probably one of the better examples where I think not only, the student actually went to the website and use of arrows and use of icons like the icons like the glue, and putting this thing together to show, we're downloading this and we're going to the files, we're finding these files, we're putting it on the slicer, and then you need to make 2 of these, and you put all these parts together, and then you make that. In 8 little visual images, he was able to represent what I thought was pretty good in terms of the key points of the process that he went through. There was a lot of other stuff involved, but filtering out what are the main steps, and what are unessential steps is part of this exercise. And some students get it really, really clearly the first time, and other students need to again repeat it with later projects. Sometimes it's hard for them to do it in an imitation project because they think that it's kind of low stakes. They don't really think about what they're doing too much. And so later, when they do another project, something that they've selected, they're maybe a little bit more engaged in trying to communicate that information. So having that, again, multiple opportunities to do that is pretty important. Now, if anybody see, hope the class goes well. Does anybody have any questions on that one, or ways that you could think of using that as a resource for your class?
I have a question.
Sure.
Did you use that as a planning tool or an after the fact at the end recapturing what you did? Like I'm thinking about progress monitoring, goal setting, and all that.
Yeah.
Executive function stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you could use it for either. I use it at the end of their imitation project. And then if they want to redo it, then I let them use it at any point in whatever project they do in the future. So they could use it as a planning document, or they could use it at the end. And I do that because a lot of times, the way that my class is structured, we're on a trimester system. So the first half of the trimester, we are doing a quick imitation project and also some, tool learning, a quick modification project, and then a quick innovation. We don't actually do the project, but we come up with an idea. We talk about, how to generate interesting ideas to creative problems. And so if that's what they want to work on in the second half of the trimester, when they can pick whatever they want, they're probably not going to finish. So it's important to give them the freedom to use that slide as a planning document rather than as a completion document. But for the imitation project, we kind of whip through that so fast that I want them to go ahead and do it so that they can think about the steps. A lot of them will tell me, there's no steps. I just print it and download it. And I'm like, well, if that's what you have to talk about, then maybe we need to think about how challenging your project is.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. So as I said, we do in my first trimester, my one trimester class, we get to innovation and we start talking about generating a creative and interesting solution to a problem. And we don't necessarily do that. I have a sort of a Maker Lab 2, another trimester class, where that's all we do. We start with a creative, interesting problem, and we spend the entire trimester doing it. And I want them to be able to think about a possible project in that first class. So we do a sort of activity where they are thinking about systems around campus. They go out on a scavenger hunt to look for interesting problems, things that can't just be fixed with a simple replacement or repair or something like that. And that could be maybe they're adding constraints to the project. And when they come up with an idea, then I have them do this activity. So they sort of have a statement of what they think their solution is, and then they need to sort of plan it out. And whether they execute it or not is completely up to them. But we talk about doing an assessment of two things. You've got your resources and skills. So, resources, any materials, any tools, any references that would potentially help you complete the project, and then skills, things that you have or would need to have in order to actually use those tools or make the parts. And so we just sort of use this basic, resources that are simple or skills that are easy. We put into the center of the grid here. Things that are, complex technical resources go over here. Things that are difficult skills, learning how to weld something that's not like, learning how to hot glue is different than learning how to weld, even though there's some similarities there. And then, whether they have have it or whether they need it. And so they place their concept in the sort of my big idea box, and then they start visually trying to represent what it is they think would be involved if they actually went down the path of doing this project. And so you can see something like this. This was the concept, the problem that they saw was that we have benches on campus, and they end up in shady areas. Nobody wants to sit on them. So their concept was to create benches that were sort of on tracks, so the benches would be able to move. You could move them into the sun as the sun is moving around, and so in order to do that, according to their assessment, is they need a bench and a drill, or the ability to, I guess, use some power tools, maybe that represents. And then some of the things that they don't have, the tracks and the wheels and things that are needed to go on the tracks. And apparently the only skill that they need to do this project is some woodworking skills. And so this would, not be the most high level response to this prompt that I could imagine. But that's an opportunity again to sort of think about how do I talk to this student about what they're thinking, because again, I'm grading them on their process. I'm grading them on these slides and their thinking process in these slides, and not on that final product. And so this is definitely a more sophisticated response to that prompt. Basically thinking about when kids go into assemblies or whatever, they leave, or I guess lunches, they leave their backpacks outside on the sidewalk. And so here you have this giant piles of backpacks. So they were thinking about having embedded storage spaces in the ground that students could drop their, almost like lockers outdoors underground. And so you can see if that's your concept, then you are starting to be able to think through some of those elements. You need to have some materials that would allow that to happen, and you need to have some skills that would allow you to do that. I think probably it's a little bit more involved in this project than just these elements. And so this is, I think, a very high level example of a student's thinking about their project in terms of a 3D printed remote control car. And so you can see they've really gotten into the details of all of the elements that they can conceive of needing for this project. And just visually, you can already get a sense that this the student is really thinking deeply about what's going to be involved in this. But then you can get into some of the nitty gritty of, what do we have? What are they thinking in terms of simple, sandpaper and wood are simple resources, whereas some of these other things would be a little bit more technical. Maybe we have them, maybe we don't have them. So that allows me, even though we never actually this student actually did end up working on this project, but even though we may never work on this project, it gives me a glimpse into whether they could set themselves up for success to maybe start tackling this project in the future. And so there are other ones. This is, an activity we do in my more advanced making class where they are designing something new. And we talk about design criteria, essential design criteria. What is the number one thing that if this object is going to work, it has to have this one thing. We do this as a sort of, maybe we've started working on this project a little bit, but we don't go too deeply into it before we start talking about this. So this was actually a table made out of broken hockey sticks, and I would say probably needed a little bit more detail than is a table. What does that mean? What does the table do? How big is it? That kind of thing. How much weight can it hold, maybe? But these other items become then the secondary thing. So he did make a table, and he made it out of hockey sticks. He did not light it up or make drawers. So that gave us sort of a hierarchy of needs for this project. And then this is sort of, for students that are really, when they're really into a deep project, this idea of an iceberg. What's the tip of the iceberg when you tell people what you want, but can we break that iceberg up into separate things? This is a very scattered assemblage of concepts for this project, and this is a much more obviously well thought out and well developed breakdown as to what's going to be involved in this project. So these things force them to stop and think, and reflect during the process, and then allow me to be able to give them feedback during the process, as well as, like I said, this is what I grade. These are the things that I grade, and that their grade is based on, not the looking at the final object at the end. I think we're coming up to the end, right? Do we have 2 minutes or do we have 10 minutes?
We have about 2 minutes.
Okay, I thought we had 10. I thought I was leaving time for Q&A, but if anybody has one last question, you can ask, and then as we go out.
I have a question. Are these all individual projects, or do you do any group work?
So the initial things are individual, and then when they get more to their free time, then yeah, we have groups develop, and they can decide to work on group projects. In the book, there's a question about Dunning-Kruger. That is the effect of when you have a little bit of knowledge and you think you're an expert. And that is definitely something that we talk a lot about in class when we get into that advanced area. Always not making assumptions about your abilities. So that's in the book as well, if you're interested in how I deal with Dunning-Kruger.